My name is John Knight Lundwall. Welcome to Myth and the Bible. In our last presentation, we discussed the confluence between myth and history, how people in the 2nd and 3rd millenniums BCE mythologized their oral historical accounts, or in the case of Ramses II at the Temple of Karnak, their written historical accounts. But in the end, what they were relaying was not modern history as we take it. Rather, they were relaying a different set of facts which concerned them greatly. This brings us to the great epistemological divide between oral and literate thinking. Oral peoples mythologize history. Oral truth is cosmic fact, right? So again, oral peoples do not have the tools necessary for modern historiography with all the notes and footnotes and the compilations. For oral people, truth is cosmic fact. The unfolding of Ramses' battle with the Hittites, what they wanted to know is what was the divine principle that caused that? And in this case, it was Ramses analogizing himself with the divine principle of the sun as it journeyed into the netherworld, rose up into the present world. Ramses II himself became an embodiment of the sun as he descended below the horizon, said his prayer to Ammon, rose up with the sun, and defeated the Hittites. This was a repetition of the cosmogony, the repetition of the creation. And in fact, much of ancient myth and oral tradition is really a repetition and recitation of these basic cosmological themes in oral cultures, their creation stories. For them, the ancient past unfolds through the divine present, right? The creation story is retold in different formats because really, as things unfold, are reborn, are renewed, as kings are victorious over enemies, this is the unfolding of order over the chaos. And so, and when they tell their stories, then they incorporate their creation mythologies or their underworld mythologies, their cosmic journey mythologies into the data, because to them, this is how history has unfolded. So this is truth to their point of view. Whereas for us, literate peoples historicize myth. We just want to know what happened. Don't give us all the mythological archetypes or analogizing with the cult systems. Just tell us what happened. And thus, for us, literate truth is historic fact. Only the facts, please. Give me the facts and only the facts about what happened in history. Well, so this is a permanent divide because we're constantly looking at ancient texts such as the Bible and asking out of it different kinds of questions that its authors were asking from their traditions. So this is a conflict in epistemology. We want to know historic fact. This is truth to us. They wanted to know cosmic fact. That was truth to them. Overlaid on top of this conflict of visions is a different kind of conflict of modern epistemology, and that is there are many Christians and Jews who read the Bible from a devotional perspective. That is, they don't care about what happened in the past, give me the facts, only the facts, as much as they want to know what the text, what the story can teach them for their current life today. So they're constantly recontextualizing the text and incorporating it into their own religious moral paradigms. And so they're reinterpreting the text based off how can this benefit me today. This is a devotional approach, and it's a valid approach. It becomes problematic when many of the people who do this do not realize that is what they're doing, and they think that they are actually incorporating historic facts into their life as opposed to recontextualizing the text out of its history into the present. Whereas on the other side, we have critical scholars who apply critical historicism, they just want to know the truth of the text, how it was formed, what group wrote it, in what cultural context was it written, what are the historic facts. And so these two different approaches to the material often produce two different kinds of data and two different views of truth. It should be noted that many modern critical scholars, using all their critical historical methods with the Bible, have to interpret the text, and they do so with a new devotionalism. Whenever you interpret an ancient text with limited data, and that's what everyone does with the Bible. Everyone has a limited set of data. So using modern critical methods, you have to be pretty minimalist with your interpretations. But very often that's not satisfying, and so modern critical scholars, many of them, will make interpretations based off their own cultural views, I would argue their own religious views, their devotional religious views, which just happens to be a new secularism. We should just be aware of that. So here we have, let me get my laser pointer up here, the Israelite tradition. So this is from Abraham to the destruction of the first temple, 587 BCE. We have the Israelites, northern and southern kingdoms, who are within a myth ritual system. All of their religion is myth ritual. Their view of truth is cosmic fact. And so Yahweh will participate in this cosmic vision, this worldview. But remember, here the basic plot structure of Ramses' victory over the Hittites was this. He, at night, was alone, faced off against the Hittites. All his helpers had fled him. He was, against a horde all by himself. At midnight, he says a prayer, and then the sun rises, and with the rising sun, he is analogized with the sun, becomes an image of Ammon, the sun god, and charges into the Hittite ranks and defeats them. And thus he becomes the god king of Egypt. That's that didn't historically happen. The battle historically happened, but the way they tell it certainly didn't historically happen. But notice how this is very similar in a plot structure to the story of Jacob. Jacob, at midnight, at a river crossing, prays to Yahweh, goes through this trial where he battles his enemy all night, and then with the rising of the sun, becomes an image of God, in fact, sees the face of God and is given a new name and founds the state of Israel. So, to be honest, this is not history. In fact, this is remarkably similar to the plot structure of Ramses' defeat over the Hittites because they share a mythological cosmovision. And so this is what we're tapping into. This is the reforms of Jeremiah especially, where he's basically saying, leave the state to the state and worship Yahweh, separately. Live your religion. For most of oral history, your religion was the city-state. Everything you did was to protect the city-state. This was actually a historical reality, but by the time of Isaiah and Jeremiah, this is being separated out to live your religion and let the city-state take care of the politics itself. Well, here, so this column is the development of the Torah. Of course, the temple is destroyed, and so we get a new form of religion, and it's literary religion, and the oral myth turns into literature. And then, of course, today, we just... modern historiography of give me only the facts. That's modern history with its citations. So we have three different forms of religious expression: oral myth, literature, modern history. But the Bible exists here within literature. Let's talk about that. So from myth to history, there is an intermediary step, which is literature. And I have this equation, essentially. The Bible equals cosmic fact, that's the epistemology of oral peoples, plus their historical tradition, both oral and what was written, that is interlaid with a literate narrative. This is the writing of the Torah with the Jews, right? So this is full literary consciousness. So cosmic fact, historical tradition is recontextualized and formatted into a literary narrative. This yields sacred literature. And this is what the Bible is. The Bible is not myth and it's not history. It partakes of both. It's the intermediary step. It is sacred literature. So what is sacred literature? Well, perhaps one of the best ways to express this is to express the kind of truth the biblical scribes were trying to express. Remember, for oral peoples, oral truth is cosmic fact, hierophany of the cosmogony, right? For literate peoples, truth is historic fact. We only want to know what happened. Well, for the biblical scribes, the truth they were trying to express was neither of these. Sacred literary truth is human fact. These are the truths of human nature. Sacred literature is recontextualizing oral truth. It's not yet concerned with only historic truth, but is now looking at the facts of human nature in history. This is what biblical narrative and the kind of truth the Bible is groping for. I'm using the term sacred literature in a biblical context. The pagan neighbors of the Jews also had sacred literature, but these were still attached to performance context and ritual cycles. The sacred literature of the surrounding cult systems was mostly epic. You get the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Mahabharata and Ramayana. These are epic cycles still dealing with mythological themes. Even the Greek playwrights, such as Sophocles, the narratives are still obviously in a performance context. The biblical scribes are doing something radically different. Their heroes are not gods and kings. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are herdsmen. Now, they're unusual, and they have hierophanies, great experiences with the divine, but the context of their lives is every man, every woman, the normal average person, the farmer, the herdsman. A sacred history and a sacred literature is not modern historiography. The modern technical term, and I'm using this phrase as a technical term, is literary fiction. Great classical literature is not the rejection of truth. It is the exploration of truth. This is the whole point of literature, is to explore the truth of ourselves. And it turns out this is the point of the Bible. The Bible is there to explore the truth of ourselves. In its ancient context, to explore the truth of the Israelite, of the Jewish experience, their relationship with God. The story is told much like the Arabian Thousand Nights. The richest king is given a gift, a slave from a foreign land. And this slave, his name is Farlimos, and he has a special divine gift. He can tell stories like no other. When he speaks, he causes people to laugh, to cry, to get angry, to fall asleep. But his greatest power is to cause people to fall in silence as they listen to the profound reality he speaks through his tales. According to the story, the court astrologers hear of the fame of Farlimos and complain to the king and tell him there's only one true holy narrative, and that is the writing in the stars, the writing of the gods, the story of the gods. To this complaint, the king responds with this famous line, "The sun and moon you know, but have you heard the tales of Farlimos?" The story points to two different kinds of truth, and I'm not going to get bogged down into to the technicalities of ancient astrology. But those two different kinds of truth are physical and material, or scientific in the modern sense, and non-physical, immaterial, metaphysical. The transcendent, the temporal, the metaphysical, the physical. Metaphysical truths are best expressed in story. In fact, all of our worldviews are created through meta-narratives, grand stories we tell ourselves which define our relationship with the cosmos and with each other. All these meta-narratives are metaphysical, all of them. This is the point Karl Popper makes, the famous German historian of science, when he says, all cosmologies are rooted in metaphysics. Another modern cosmologist sums up his discipline in this way: we create fantasy worlds in which we apply mathematics and formulas, right? So a modern cosmology is rooted in scientific principle, but the scientific principles are linked together in a dot-to-dot construction that is framed through a meta-narrative, a metaphysic, a fantasy world. I'm not deconstructing modern science, on the contrary, but there is a meta-narrative of modern secularism that says we can dispense with religion, we have science and reason. Science gives us formulas, mathematical tables, and facts about material things. The ontology of our meta-narrative, what gives us meaning, is not this. Rather, it's a system of values created through a metaphysic. This is only derived through philosophy and religion. This is the way the human psyche evolved. Whatever human consciousness is, it is primarily a storytelling machine that creates metaphysical systems of meaning. In any case, the Bible is a tool of literature that describes the meaning of human fact in the context of human nature. Take the story of David as an example. King David is the founder of the royal state, the great founder of the dynasty in Israel. He puts Israel on the map. And of course, according to the story, he is a faithful shepherd boy, a righteous, good-hearted, well-intended person who, through faith alone, faces off against the entire Philistine army. There's a face-off between him and Goliath. Goliath is equipped with the best armor, steel, and weaponry of the age. And of course, David has a tunic, a leather strap, and a rock. And David wins. He wins and founds the state of Israel and is at least ostensibly, a righteous king. Now, if the redactors and editors and writers of the Bible wanted to create an ideology around political propaganda or religious propaganda, they would have left the story at that. But the story keeps going. And we learn another side of this great King David. He sees Bathsheba bathing on a rooftop and lusts after her. Well, he's married and she's married, and there are very tight moral rules that can't be broken. But hey, he's king and he wants her. So he sleeps with her, and then to cover up the lie, he orders her husband Uriah to the front lines of a battle so that he could be killed. And if you keep reading, it turns out not only does he kill Uriah in this way, he kills an entire company, a platoon of men, to hide his lie. David starts as the righteous boy king of Israel, the preeminent archetype, the King Arthur of the land. But he ends a liar, an adulterer, and a murderer. Now, if you were going to commit yourself to a propaganda of the state of Israel, you would not write this. But they wrote this. One of the genius things about the Bible is its authors canonized its critics. It made sure that when they recorded the human facts of their historical tradition, they incorporated the fruit of the good and the fruit of the bad. And in fact, most of the major characters in the Bible come with flaws, and this is a move of brilliance. Abraham laughs at God. Moses disobeys God. Jonah runs away from God. Job can't stand God. And on it goes. So David turns out to be a rather sloppy king. Solomon, who is wise according to tradition, if you read the text, he's not wise at all. In fact, most of the kings of Israel are written by the authors and editors in a way that shows a very human, fallible side and how power corrupts. This is part of the genius of the Bible. And in essence, this is what great literature does. It stays with the human facts and separates itself from ideology, propaganda, and indoctrination. In the first time in history, the cultural, canonical metanarrative has been turned into literature. That's never happened before, and it changes the scope and course of Western civilization. In fact, it invents Western civilization. When considering the Western canon of literature, perhaps it's best to turn to Harold Bloom, America's leading literary critic. He said that the purpose of the Western canon of literature, the primary purpose, is to encounter the self in solitude. This is, I think, a great insight. The whole purpose of reading great literature is to compare yourself to the people and events that you are reading about. In some sense, this is a devotional approach to literature. And if we are to encounter ourselves in solitude when reading the Bible, then we encounter ourselves within the narrative frameworks that the Bible gives us, and then ask ourselves, what would we do given that situation? It is G.K. Chesterton who wrote that the apex of human imagination is to consider all the things that didn't happen. That is to say, to consider how history could have happened had the good been applied better, or had more evil unfolded. And so, again, the point of reading great literature is to explore reality. It's not the historical recitation of reality, but to explore the contours of reality next to human nature. And this is the purpose of biblical literature. Harold Bloom is less convinced that the Western canon of literature is there to progress cultural values, but it does. It does. A canon of literature will embody cultural values, but it should be noted, as Bloom, much of the canon is critical of culture. In fact, to encounter the self in solitude is to question one's meta-narrative, one's cultural meta-narrative around you. And so the Western canon certainly provides a framework of cultural values that traditionally, that is why the humanities is a prescribed course of learning, so that as you go and learn your undergraduate information, you learn the values of Western civilization. Bloom also notes that if we read literature with an ideology, then we never end up really reading the text. And this is true. We end up reading our ideology into the text. So the whole methodology of approaching great literature is to try to read it without ideology. And this is where religious structures have shortchanged biblical literature. Because, sure enough, Catholicism has a certain way of reading the Bible. Evangelical fundamentalism has a certain way of reading the Bible. They read the Bible through their ideologies, and very often that means they're not reading the text for what the text says. They are reading their ideology as the text. One of the things I sometimes do when I read the Bible is to replace, every time the name of God is mentioned, Yahweh or Jehovah or Jesus, to replace that name with the name of a non-Christian deity, Vishnu, Allah, Buddha. And so as I read the text, I will substitute the name of God for a different deity, simply as a way to cold shock me out of reading the text through an ideology. It helps remind me that I should be reading the text for what the text is saying. I fully understand that this probably offends some pious readers of the Bible, but look, I revere and respect the Bible a great deal. I mostly read it, however, as a scholar, trying to pull out of it what the text is actually saying. The purpose of this series is to show how orality and literacy met the transmission of the oral tradition, and to show the complexity of merging myth into history via sacred literature. I often say that the Bible is Shakespeare before Shakespeare. You couldn't get a Shakespeare without first a writing of something like the Bible. And again, this offends both the believers and the critics who want to deconstruct and just say, it's all myth. Both groups tend to be light on Shakespeare, by the way. In any case, I record this here 2021 when we are really sort of at the end of biblical literacy, and that is people being literate with biblical themes. I don't even know how many people even know who Moses was. The university in the humanities has largely been ransacked by a new metanarrative, postmodern progressivism, which is essentially just social Marxism, neo-Marxism. It's a poor substitute for the Western Canon of literature. It is all ideology, roiling ideology. In some sense, no text can be read in this climate of ideology first that the modern university has given us. I say we should get back to Shakespeare, but we have to check our ideology at the door and read these texts for the texts. If we do that, then actually re-engaging with the Bible might in fact produce some real revelations.